Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this presentation, where we'll be taking you on a journey around the world in 1,642 days, looking at the transition from 1192 to 19650 and the UK implementation of the ISO 19650 series. I'm joined by Emma Hooper of Barn Digital and Andy Boutle from Kia, who will introduce themselves shortly. So by way of introduction, my name's Paul Shilcock, Principal Advisor at Opram. We're a small management consultancy who support organisations around the world to build better teams by providing a range of advisory services and educational resources relating to the industry standards and best practice for the management of information. And for some context, I'm the author of ISO 19650 Part 2 and the UK National Annex, plus co-author of PAS 1192 Part 2 and the UK Transition Guidance PD 19650-0. So I'm going to kick off the presentation by giving you some background as to how the new standards came about, the development process, and what it means for those of you who have already aligned your business processes to the UK 1192 series. Emma will then take you through some of the key changes from the UK 1192 series, and Andy will finish off the presentation by highlighting some of the guidance and support available to organisations wishing to adopt the ISO 19650 series. Okay, so hopefully by now you'll have heard that the ISO have published the first two standards within the ISO 19650 series, both of which have been adopted by CEN, the European standards body, and the BSI, who have published both documents as British standards. Part 1 covers the concepts and principles for the management of information throughout the asset lifecycle, whilst Part 2 focuses on the management of information during the delivery phase of assets. So for those of you familiar with the UK initiatives around BIM and the development of the UK 1192 series, you'll recognise this timeline, starting with the publication of BS 1192, which is the code of practice for the collaborative production of information, the use of which was to be required by all publicly funded projects from April 2016. And this was set out within the government's construction strategy published in 2011, which first introduced this term BIM Level 2. At the time, BIM Level 2 wasn't well defined, and so the next 5 years or so was spent developing the standards needed to support BIM Level 2, and for both clients and suppliers to align their business processes accordingly. Now, the internationalisation of the UK 1192 series has always been part of the plan, as this would enable the UK construction industry to export more of their products and services around the world. But contrary to popular belief, it wasn't the UK who pushed these standards onto the international community. What actually happened was that the clients around the world who also wanted to reduce risk, increase predictability, and achieve real business benefits from better information about their assets started to require projects to deliver in accordance with the UK 1192 series. And it was the international community who felt that this was slightly unfair and demanded that the UK 1192 series was to be elevated to international level as soon as possible. So in June 2014, the International Working Group met for the first time in London to embark upon a journey that would take them 1,642 days to complete. So what did that journey look like? So in terms of the ISO 19650 series, at its heart, we have these three documents: BS 1192, PAS 1192 Part 2, and PAS 1192 Part 3. BS 1192, looking at the collaborative production of information; PAS 1192 Part 2, looking at the management of information throughout the delivery phase; and PAS 1192 Part 3, looking at the management of information through the operational phase of assets. So the first step for David Churcher and I as the authors, was to strip out all the contents of these three documents. We then went ahead and took out all the UKisms, stuff around the strategy and the UK government bit. And what we were left with was a set of raw text. We then, from that text, we then took out the concepts and principles around the management of information throughout the asset lifecycle. So for BS 1192, this is around the collaborative production of information within a shared repository, which we know and love as a common data environment. And for Part 2 and 3, this is around the management of information and the activities within the information management process for both the delivery and operational phase. So all of this went into ISO 19650 Part 1. We then took out the main clauses from BS 1192 and PAS 1192 Part 2. So in terms of BS 1192, this is around the people aspect of the common data environment in terms of the generation, coordination, check, review, approve, authorize and acceptance of information within a shared repository. And for PAS 1192 Part 2, this is around the activities for the effective management of information, which forms the project information management process. So these clauses were then put into ISO 19650 Part 2. You'll notice Part 3 isn't included, that's currently being elevated to international level within ISO 19650 Part 3. Now through this journey, there was still some text left from the core documents, and through the process it became clear that there were certain aspects that we were never going to get an international consensus on. So the remaining clauses went into what's known as a national annex. Now the idea behind this is that it doesn't add any additional requirements to ISO 19650 Part 2. All it does is it allows each country or region to add clarifications of how the activities within the project information management process are to be implemented within that particular country or region. And so for the UK, we developed the UK National Annex to ISO 19650 Part 2. So you can start to see now how the restructuring came about, and there's a bit of a misconception that Part 1 of ISO Part 1 is just BS 1192 and ISO 19650 Part 2 is PAS 1192 Part 2. We can see here the restructuring around the concepts and principles and the actual requirements, which hopefully makes it a bit more easier to read and a little bit more logical in terms of its structure. To help organisations through this transition, the BSI published PD 19650 Part 0, which is a transition guidance from 1192 to ISO 19650. So what happens to the UK 1192 series? Well, prior to January 2019, for those of you who've already aligned your business processes to the UK 1192 series or adopting the series on a project, you'll be using these 6 documents, ranging from the collaborative production of information, management of information through the delivery and operational phase, the structure of asset data to be handed over to the client in accordance with UKBI, adopting a security-minded approach to the management of information relating to sensitive assets, and looking at the use of structured health and safety information throughout the delivery and operational phase. So it's these 6 documents which form the UK 119. Now that ISO 19650 Parts 1 and 2 being published, BS 1192 and PAS 1192 Part 2 have been withdrawn and replaced by ISO's Parts 1 and 2. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't use BS 1192 or PAS 1192 Part 2. The status of withdrawn simply means that the BSI will no longer maintain those 2 documents. But if you are using those on an existing project, then continue to do so, and clients have the choice to either continue to use the BS 1192 and PAS 1192 Part 2 or adopt the new ISO standards. So from January 2019, this is now what the UK 1192 series looks like. As I mentioned before, Part 3 is currently in development, likewise with Part 5. So we're hopeful that those 2 standards will be published early next year in 2020. So you can start to see that the UK 1192 series is now starting to take shape in terms of its international counterparts. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Emma Hooper, who's going to take you through some of the main changes from 1192 into ISO 19650.